In this video, I'm gonna talk about Blaster Master 0, 1, 2, 3, cha-cha-cha. One of the good things about 8-bit gaming of the bygone days was that it kept things simple. You had a D-pad, 2 or 3 buttons, and then the developers had to make a game out of this. It kept the limits within melee range at the cost of the elbow room. The insidious and counterintuitive side effect was that it made games more complicated due to there not being enough buttons to do what any sane person would have done in a real-life situation, such as shooting in one direction and walking in another at the same time. Meanwhile, the PC Master Race is busy playing X-Wing, which had the bright idea of making every single key on the keyboard do something. The two extremes lived right next to each other with no one complaining, because nobody had figured out that there could be a middle ground between the beep-boop machine connected to the TV and the 166 MHz space heater connected to the monitor. It has been roughly 30 years since that epic epoch, and even to this day, neo-retro gaming is still attempting to bridge the gap between the simplicity of yesterdecades and the convenience brought by the conventions of today. It is pretty rare that I found the proportions to feel just right. Perhaps rose-colored glasses have something to do with it. Perhaps it has to do with memories of mastering a video game that has been made exceedingly difficult because there is only so much content that one can fit into a cartridge, and making the player deal with unforgiving bullshit is a cheap way to make a game feel 10 times longer than it really is. On the other side of the equation, we have developers who attempt to make a completely modernized take on a classic game and find out the hard way that the essence and the spirit of the original have been butchered in the process. They are under orders from corporate, and they are far too invested into it to back out, and this is how a studio hands out an abortion like Bionic Commando 2009. They are sheepishly telling us the cocktail is a Manhattan, except the ingredients are gin, sparkling cider, and black bean sauce. Somebody out there figured out that the pixels of old-school gaming allowed for precision. You could see where you were going. You could see what you were shooting. There were no moments of being certain that you had hit somebody, and yet the game had decided otherwise. There was a substantial comfort with looking at lines so clean that they would have made Hergé blush. And then that same somebody figured out that they did not need to push the limits all the way into infinity. All they had to do was push them far enough to turn the elbow room into enough space to spin around with one's arms outstretched, add a reasonable margin of error, and then keep those limits well within sight. This is how the formerly convoluted controls of the original Blaster Master feel so much roomier now that they can exist on the equivalent of a modern Xbox controller. You have a shoot button, a jump button, a special weapon button, an interact button, a couple of utility buttons, and a pair of shortcut buttons that you can make into whatever you wish. If it involves selecting something, the game politely freezes time so that you can make your choice at your own leisure. If it involves going on foot, you even get a button to lock yourself in one direction while walking in any other direction at the same time. It feels natural, like features that should have existed all along, but could not because of technical limitations at the time. The basic story is that you are a boy genius who chases a frog into a wormhole and then finds a battle tank specifically designed to fight back mutant monsters from outer space. It does not make any more sense in context, until it starts making sense, but you will have to play the entire trilogy to see the plotline tie up all of its loose ends. It makes more sense to describe this as the episodes 1, 2, and 3 of a single unified game, because the look and the feel remains the same all throughout. Episode 1 is quite simply a retelling of the original Nintendo game in a reviewed and corrected format. Episode 2 takes the adventure to new locations, and Episode 3 takes one long draw that obliterates the entire spliff in one fell swoop, and I will stop here before I wander into spoiler territory. At the core, it remains a director's cut edition of what should have been all along, even if the director is not the same. I know I said that the 3 games are more episodes than separate games, but that is not entirely true either. There are a few differences between them, and while they do play as direct continuations of one another, they are not entirely limited to being level packs. The second game introduces, for example, a mechanic that refills your magic meter if you fall from a great height. It is literally an inversion of fall damage. It is so simple and so clever that I am angry at myself for not having thought of that. The episodic design remains a constant, and what happens in the next installments imply prior knowledge of the predecessors for the plot points to make any sense. Compounding on top of that is the difficulty curve in which the first episode is the easy mode, the second one is average, and the third one is an entire final exam of a video game that tests everything you have seen and learned. To put that in Witcher terms, the series goes through the progression of alchemy is not required, alchemy is useful, and alchemy is demanded. I need to expand on this, because this is not as straightforward as simply asking the player to push the buttons quicker. Most of the boss fights in the first game can be dealt with by mashing the shoot button and by having fully replenished resources before getting into the battle. The boss fights in the second installment are much more cerebral, and the usual approach of the best offense is the best defense can and will backfire on you on several occasions. Examining and learning the enemy telegraphs makes a world of difference, even in the latter stages of the first game. The third game is the Doctorate Grandmaster level. You need to switch weapons mid-fight in order to counter the attacks coming at you. You need to figure out the proper sub-weapons to use and when to activate them. It is no longer a matter of finding the right loadout for the fight. It is a matter of countering each and every motion of your opponent with the right tool. Until you learn this lesson, you will repeat each boss fight at least a dozen times over. As counterintuitive as it sounds, most of the boss fights in the third installment are spent in the menu, in which you put away your wave gun and take out your laser whip because the boss just flashed in a color that you recognize. This is usually the part that nobody knows how to deal with, and that includes me. You can probably get through the entire series with brute force, but it will be a frustrating exercise until you learn to take a step back and figure out that your arsenal does not stop at whichever weapon is at the bottom of your list. I can only blame the first installment for teaching that every weapon is better than the last, even if the second game attempts to backpedal on the idea as much as it can. Apparently, there are DLC characters that can inject more life into the series by way of starkly different mechanics, but the idea of playing Shantae inside of a tank on wheels is not exactly high on my priority list. I am certain that somebody else will be attracted by the crossover, but I have had my personal fill to feel just right. If you want more game per game, then you can throw a few dollars at the DLC characters so as to spice up your next playthrough. I am only disappointed that there is no Blaster Master Zero and Knuckles. Without factoring the DLC, the base experience can last for 30 hours, equally spread out between the 3 installments, which is par for the course in the genre. This also includes some wiggle room for backtracking and exploration, because you bet your 2 full moons that you will be going back to get every collectible if you know what is good for you. It is not like you have to find 51 missile packs anyway, and many of the upgrades actually do have a reasonable use beyond looking pretty in your inventory. It took me a couple of weeks before I could come to terms with my experience, because there are some wham episodes to process in the storyline, and there are things that feel like a punishment at first, but once you let them decant for a while, they transform into lessons to learn. Only these are not the lessons taught by most common of mortals even in the enriched curriculum. These are the lessons that are part of the much maligned and yet helpful school of life. These are the experiences that break us out from the rails of stagnant predictability. The reason they generate so many complaints is because nobody expects them. Some of the challenges put forth are well beyond sight of the beaten path, and not everyone can handle them, for better or worse. These are the walls that are tough and intimidating to surmount, and though we cannot see it in the heat of the moment, they make us stronger. We sweat, we clench our fists in our teeth, we yell out cries, we get a novel idea, we execute it precisely, we stand on top, and we stomp our feet just to rub it in that we finally got it done. And the next day, we come back and say thank you. In short, this game is the father I wish I had, and that none of us deserve.